All right, welcome everybody. Good evening. It is Tuesday, so that means it's Bible study night. Welcome back. We are ready to begin now our 19th session on the Gospel of John, and we are now getting to the last chapters. We're transitioning now from the chapters that we've been discussing these last weeks. Have been Jesus talking to his disciples for the last time, teaching them, sharing them, praying for them, and then giving them guidance and strength for the days that are to come. And that really took like 4 chapters. I mean, we were to that farewell discussion on the eve of what we would today call Holy Friday. Was a hefty 4+ chapters, beginning with Judas, leaving to betray Christ, Peter asserting that he would never leave Christ or never betray him, even to death, and all the way through all those chapters to now chapter 18. So now, as we enter into chapter 18, we're transitioning out of that. The discussion is over, the prayer is over, and now we're going to be hearing St. John's account of Christ's passion. So St. John's account is very interesting because, of course, he's the only one of the 4 evangelists that actually was there. He was the only one that actually witnessed these events firsthand. So he's going to give us, just as he has been doing throughout all these chapters, he's going to give us more details. He's going to flesh out some of these scenes that maybe the other evangelists, kind of leave to the basics. And he's going to skip over some things that we know from the other evangelists, because again, he doesn't feel the need to recount them again, knowing that his audience would have been well aware of all the events that Matthew, St. Mark, and St. Luke had accounted in their gospel accounts. So with that brief introduction to the 18th chapter of the Gospel according to John, why don't we begin? We're now in verse 1. When Jesus had spoken these words, meaning the prayer, the high priestly prayer from chapter 17, he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. So in the gospel accounts of St. Matthew and St. Mark, they identify this garden as the Garden of Gethsemane at the Mount of Olives. So St. John doesn't give us the name, but we know from the other accounts that that's what we're talking about here. So that would have been just east of the temple, near in Jerusalem, just east of the Temple Mount. So it would have been an enclosed private area, definitely somewhere that you could meet privately, but outside, for Jesus and his disciples to pray and to reflect, especially during this feast of Passover. So Father Lawrence Farley, in his commentary on the Gospel of John, he writes that maybe it belonged to one of Jesus's followers, one of his sympathizers, who would have offered it to him and his disciples for that evening. In the next verse, we'll see that St. John comments that they had been there before. They definitely gathered there on previous occasions too, so that's plausible. Father Stephen de Jong proposes that it basically is like a park, but not a park the way that we would think of it, with kind of an open lawn area, but more like a national park, lots of trees and nature, but on a very much smaller scale. So basically a small area that was kind of left to be natural, was not altered in any way. So that's kind of the imagery that we get here of where that Christ and his disciples are now going to the Garden of Gethsemane. So I find it interesting, and I always like to make connections. So I find it interesting that now Jesus and his disciples go to the garden, which eventually is where Christ will be betrayed and arrested. And in the book of Genesis, of course, the Garden of Eden is where Adam and Eve transgressed the commandment of God and are cast out of paradise. So, it's something that as I was reading and studying, it just kind of clicked in my brain. I was like, oh, it's a garden, just like in the beginning when mankind turned against God in the Garden of Eden. Now humanity again will turn against God, and this time it will be in the Garden of Gethsemane. So just something interesting to pique your interest. So in the other Gospels, this is where Jesus would have prayed for the cup of the cross to be taken from him. That very famous part of the scriptures where Christ is weeping and sweat is falling from his face like drops of blood. Very vivid imagery. And Christ is praying, saying, "Father, please let this cup pass from me, but if not, my will, your will, but not my will, but yours." That's where this scene would have taken place. St. John skips over it. Again, it's something that was included in the other gospel accounts. He doesn't find a necessity to share it again here. Plus, it doesn't really fit into what St. John is trying to it doesn't fit into his kind of viewpoint of what's happening here. That scene, although again, it's not to say that it didn't happen, it just was recounted by the other evangelists. That scene shows that Christ's inner agony, his struggle, the inner kind of, I don't know if conflict is the right word, but he's definitely struggling with the reality that he's going to go to the cross. So that's not what St. John is trying to show. And we'll see as we go through this chapter. St. John is trying to show how Christ's death is voluntary and how he is really in control of the proceedings from the jump. So St. John may have also decided to exclude that detail just because it doesn't really fit into the purpose of his narrative of this story. All right, so that brings us to verse 2. And Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So there you go. So St. John includes that detail there, that they had been there before. It's not their first time going to the garden. Then Judas, having received a detachment of troops and officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. So Judas leads the arrest team to the garden, since he also knew where they were going and where they were planning on meeting after they had eaten the meal together. Because, of course, he was with them until just a few hours ago. He would have been aware of their plans. So he's able to lead the detachment of these guards, basically, to where Jesus and the disciples are planning on going. The garden also gives them a good place to kind of launch their plan into action because it's a secluded area. It's private. There's minimal attention from the crowded Jerusalem streets, and gives them an opportunity to kind of arrest Jesus very quietly without arousing suspicion. Because if the people knew that the Pharisees had arrested Jesus, a riot could break out. And don't forget that at the Passover, at the time of the great feasts, the great pilgrimage feasts, the population of Jerusalem would triple. So it was very packed there. And the pressure was basically would have turned the whole city into a pressure cooker waiting to explode. So they wanted to do it quietly. And this way, they were able to kind of corner him in the garden and take him by night in a stealthy way. So another reason that the chief priest certainly would not have wanted to do this publicly and start an insurrection or start a riot is because the Romans, if there was unrest in the city, would have definitely taken action and would have had no problem starting with killing people, to kind of quell the emotions of the crowd. In fact, Herod, sometime before this Passover, some years before, there had been a revolution, a Passover revolution in Jerusalem, and he had crucified 150 Jews. He had rounded up 150 Jews and just crucified them to put down the riot. So the Jews would have had that in their memory. That chief priest would have had that in their memory and would have tried to do everything they could to do it quietly. So it's interesting too that the chief priests had kind of their own guard, their own police that they could use for the temple purposes, because Romans, the Jews were not allowed to have their own military, but the Roman military and police, or whatever they would have called it, were not able to enter into the temple. The temple proper was only for Jews. So this guard was given to the high priest to kind of govern over the temple area. So this is who we're talking about here. We're not talking necessarily about Romans. We're talking about Jews that are now being sent to arrest Jesus. St. Mark's gospel tells us that the weapons, St. John mentions weapons there, are swords and clubs. It's more likely that they weren't necessarily afraid of the disciples. I mean, if you think about it, the disciples are 12 fishermen, probably not very skilled in fighting or military tactics, but of confronting Jesus, who had shown miraculous powers in the past. He had worked all these wonders and signs and wonders throughout his life on earth, and so it's more probable, especially for Father Lawrence Farley, whose comments on this, that they were actually more worried about what Jesus was going to do to them than what his disciples were going to do to them. And to kind of make this point, I want to read one passage from the Old Testament, from the second book of Kings, chapter 1, verses 9 to 10, to kind of paint a picture of what they might be expecting. This is from the life of the prophet Elijah or Elias. So I'll just read this quickly here. Then he, meaning King Ahaziah, who's the son of Ahab. Ahab is like a horrible king who hates Elijah. So now this is his son. Sent to Elijah a captain with his company of 50 men. The captain went up to Elijah, who was sitting on the top of a hill, and said to him, "Man of God, the king says, come down." Elijah answered the captain, "If I am a man of God, may fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men." Then fire fell from heaven and consumed the captain and his men. So people, again, as Jews, they would have been familiar with these stories, especially the prophet Elijah is a big character in the Old Testament. So, they must have been wondering, is this the kind of person that, does this Jesus have similar powers? Is this Jesus able to call fire down from heaven and, consume us with divine fire if he wishes? So they come armed and prepared. All right, that brings us to verse 4. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that would come upon him, went forward and said to them, "Whom are you seeking?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." And Judas, who betrayed him, also stood with them. Now when he had said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Then he asked them again, "Whom are you seeking?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I have told you that I am he. Therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way, that the saying might be fulfilled which he spoke, of those whom you gave me, I have lost none." So again, St. John here emphasizes that Jesus knew everything that was happening. And so when the guard comes to arrest him, he meets them on the way. He comes to the door and meets them basically. So even though Jesus knows that the garden is the perfect place for them to come and get him, he doesn't change course. He doesn't scatter and flee. He doesn't make a break for it. He goes into it willingly. In fact, he comes out of the garden and meets them. Father Lawrence Farley, he writes there, they did not find him. He found them. And I think that's a good way, again, of showing that Jesus is really kind of master of proceedings at this point. And we'll see that will continue as it goes on. So the arresting party, it seems, doesn't know who is greeting them at the door. They certainly would not have been expecting Jesus to come and greet them. Especially knowing Jesus obviously knew that they wanted him dead. They probably thought Jesus was going to be inside hiding, send one of his disciples to come and kind of find out what's going on. But obviously that's not what they got. So when he tells them that he's the one, and in doing so, he uses again that divine name. We've talked about that from the Old Testament book of Exodus, when Moses is talking to the burning bush, and Moses says, "If the people ask me what the name of God is, what shall I tell them?" And God tells him, "I am." I go, and that's what Jesus uses here. That word "he," it says "I am he." That word "he" is actually not in the original Greek. It's just "I am." Ego me, I am. So the "he" is added as part of the translation, which is literally the divine name of God. So when they hear this divine name of God, they fall down in worship, inadvertently, because they've used, Jesus has now used the name above every other name. So they fall over him. So this shows again that they're in some level they're afraid of him, right? That he announces that he is the one, and he uses the divine name, and they literally fall down. Because again, maybe they were worried that he was going to do something, right? He was going to send fire down and consume them, just like Elijah did. Jesus asks them again a second time who they're looking for. It's almost like he's coaching them through the arrest. He's like, it's like, okay, who are you looking for, guys? I told you it was me. What are you guys waiting for? Let's get moving here. So again, it shows that he's in command. He's the one that's in charge right now, and he's really taking it to them, not in a violent form, of course, but he's taking the initiative through this process. So when the arresting party answers that they're looking for him and him alone, they don't say you and your disciples, they just say you, basically. He uses it as a reason for them to let the rest of the disciples go, for the sake of their safety and their protection. So even now, in this moment, Jesus is first and foremost concerned with the safety of the disciples, not with his own safety. He fulfills his own words. If you remember, in the prayer, in the high priestly prayer from chapter 17, he's praying to the Father, and he says, I have lost none of them, right? He says that directly. He says, I have lost none of them except the son of perdition, and of course that son of perdition is Judas. And St. John has already told us where Judas is standing. And he's standing on the other team. He's standing with the other team now. So Jesus is now fulfilling the words that he spoke in his high priestly prayer, so that they can be safe and kept from harm in this moment. Now, Jesus has told them, right? He's told them that the world will come after you and hate you and will kill you. He's told them that, but now is not the time. They're not ready to face their martyrdoms yet, and God doesn't place burdens on them that they can't carry. So here he shows them that even when the world does come to get them, when the world comes after them to persecute them and kill them, that Jesus will be there to protect them. And if you read the lives of the saints, especially the martyr saints, you see that some of them, like the life of St. George, they tried to kill him like 10 times. I mean, they tried to poison him. They tried to burn him. I mean, they tried all these different ways of killing him, and nothing worked. Until finally he was, God gave the blessing, so to speak, for the saint to give up his life in martyrdom. So it shows us that even in our moments of tribulation, that God will look out for us. We may suffer in the short term, meaning in this life, but in the long term, Christ will be standing with us and doing everything that we need for our protection, for our salvation. So again, St. John doesn't include this, but it's at this point where Judas would have given the kiss of betrayal, again, from which we see from the other gospel accounts, to fully identify the man speaking as the real Jesus. Because of course, one of the disciples could have come and answered the door and said, oh yes, I'm Jesus, how can I help you? And kind of taken the place of Jesus while meanwhile he's sneaking out the back or something like that. So Judas would have had to give the sign, basically, that this person speaking is actually Jesus, and then they would have arrested him. So that's that. So now Jesus has been arrested by or Jesus is now speaking to his arresters. So in verse 10, we now get the next part of the story. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, put your sword into the sheath. Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me? So it's interesting there too that we get the same language of Jesus's prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane here, drinking the cup. So Jesus, even if he had gone through that moment of anguish in the garden, he's definitely come to terms with it at this point in his humanity. So these couple of verses, we have to think back to, again, the beginning of the farewell discourse, where Peter promises and claims absolute loyalty to Christ. And he says that, even if I have to die, I will follow you. And so here he tries to live up to that. He has a sword in St. Luke's account. He actually instructs the disciples to have swords with them. They say we have 2 swords, and he tells them that's enough. And St. Peter must have had one of them. Now, most likely it was not a very large sword. It may have even been kind of a large knife, something that they would have had handy, as fishermen to mend nets or cut fish or whatever they would have had. It probably was not. We shouldn't think of it kind of like in the movies where they have some long, fancy sword. Peter, they were fishermen. They didn't have money to buy high technology weaponry for the day. But Peter had one of these weapons. So he attacks the servant of the high priest. So St. Peter is still assuming here that Jesus' kingdom is an earthly one. He shows here that he still is not really comprehending what Jesus has taught about himself and about his kingdom. And so he fights for this kingdom with earthly means, with violence. But the kingdom of God cannot be spread with violence like that. The scripture here implies even that St. Peter is trying to kill the man. The Greek word is not so much like struck, like it was like a clean hit. It was like he was trying to inflict some serious damage. And he does, obviously. To lose your ear is not a small thing, but he was trying to do even more damage, is the implication from the text. He only succeeds though in cutting off his ear. So Jesus rebukes Peter. He tells him, put your sword back into its sheath, because it's the will of his Father. It's the will of God now for Christ to go forward to Golgotha, to be arrested and tried and then to go to his crucifixion. And again, the kingdom of God is not spread with violence. It's spread with peace and joy and love. And we've talked about that, how in the early church, the Christianity spread because of the radical love of the first Christians. Taking care of the poor, feeding the hungry, saving innocent, children who had been abandoned to die, things like that. So the fact that St. Peter is not arrested as well right on the spot after having attacked one of these guards also shows that, Jesus is in control, because he had asked them to let the disciples go. Peter brutally attacks one of the guards, and they don't do anything. They leave him. They leave him and they take Jesus, because Jesus had asked them to do that. And so they do. They obey him. So again, Jesus is in control. St. John is making it very clear that Jesus is in control of proceedings. All right, verse 12. Then the detachment of troops and the captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. And they led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. So Annas was a former high priest. Two different sources I found. One said that he had been deposed by the Romans, which was not uncommon for them to do. And then in succession, 5 of his sons had been appointed to that office. And then at that time, it happened to be Caiaphas' son-in-law. Another thing I found was that Annas didn't want to retire from the high priesthood. And so he kind of shared duties with the other high priests as they came along. So Annas and Caiaphas are kind of sharing the high priesthood. Annas he's kind of the head of the dynasty, if we can think of it that way, that he seems to have been a very powerful personality in the Jewish ranks. And so the fact that they brought Jesus to him first, even though Caiaphas was the high priest at that time, kind of speaks to this. That in the family pecking order, Annas comes first as the elder. St. John also adds this detail here about Caiaphas being the one who told the Jews that it was good for one man to die for the people. Now, that was from earlier in the book of John, the gospel according to John, where the Jews are trying to decide what to do. And Caiaphas, the same Caiaphas, tells them that, he says, you guys don't understand anything. It is expedient for one man to die for the sake of the people. Now, he says it at that time to mean that it's better for Jesus to die instead of there being an insurrection and all these other Jews dying on his behalf, than for Jesus to lead some resurrection. I keep saying resurrection, but to lead a revolution and have it be squashed by Rome. Now he says it meaning that, but he unintentionally prophesies of what Christ will do and what Christ is going to do. Right? That Christ will die for the sake of all the people, and it will be good that he does that, So St. John reminds us of that here, that this is the same Caiaphas who unwittingly prophesied that Christ would die for the sake of the people. Not to save them from Rome, but to save them from death and hell. So Jesus has much higher aims than Caiaphas does. So now verse 15, and Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Now that disciple was known to the high priest, and went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door outside. Then the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to her who kept the door, and brought Peter in. Then the servant girl who kept the door said to Peter, You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you? He said, I am not. Now the servants and officers who had made a fire of coals stood there, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves. And Peter stood with them and warmed himself. So now these two disciples, one being Peter and one being John himself, it was very common in the ancient world for authors to remain anonymous when they're writing themselves into their own stories. So St. John is now talking about himself. Follow Jesus, and they make their way into the courtyard outside of Annas' residence. So it's interesting here that St. John will use Annas' interrogation of Christ, which we'll see in the next verses, as the backdrop for Peter's denials. So these two things are happening at the same time. So St. John is showing us that Jesus was abandoned and rejected by everybody, by his friends and by his foes. That he's truly alone here at this point. The only one really that sticks with him, even to the cross, is St. John himself, and the women disciples who stand off at a distance, which we'll hear not in this chapter, but as we move forward. So this first denial of St. Peter, he's attempting to gain entry into the court so that he can help Jesus if he can, right? If he wants to be there to help if he can. So his intentions are good. He doesn't want the doorkeeper to deny him access. So he says what he needs to say to get in, but it's still a denial. Aren't you also one of the disciples? No, I'm not. He still denies it. And there really isn't a need for him to deny his relationship to Christ, right? The servant girl who's opening the door for him hardly could do anything. Right? She's just a servant girl. And she already knows John, clearly, because she let John in. And she knows that he's one of his disciples, because she tells Peter, aren't you also one of his disciples, right? Like with this guy, aren't you like with this guy with Jesus too? And she didn't do anything to just St. John. So I don't know, it's not really like a high risk person to profess Christ to, And yet, despite this kind of seeming lack of pressure, St. Peter denies Christ for the first time. The Orthodox Study Bible makes a note that the servant girls testing Peter here is in one sense kind of like a retelling of the story of Adam and Eve giving the fruit to Adam. In that case, in this case, the fallen nature of man, which we see in St. Peter here, will be overcome by the death and resurrection of Christ, which will be first proclaimed by the women disciples, because the men will be hiding in fear. So an interesting another connection to that Genesis story, going back all the way, to last year where we began studying the book of Genesis. So in verse 19, we read, the high priest, meaning Annas, then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. Jesus answered him, I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where the Jews always meet, and in secret I have said nothing. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. Indeed, they know what I said. And when he had said these things, one of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, do you answer the high priest like that? Jesus answered him, if I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why do you strike me? Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So, Annas here is interrogating Jesus, not because he's really interested in learning what Jesus has to say. He's looking for evidence. He's looking for something to use against him in his official trial, because even if the Sanhedrin, which is Caiaphas and the other leaders of the Jews, find him guilty and deserving of death, the Romans will have to decide that, which we'll see later on in this chapter. So they're looking to find whatever evidence they can to use against him in his official trial before Pilate, which will happen later in this chapter. So Jesus reasserts, that he never has had any secret agendas, and that if Annas wants to learn more, he can ask the people who, heard him speak. Because again, he spoke very plainly. He wasn't, doing anything subversive. So Jesus gets slapped for his response. He gets a hit by the guard of the high priest Annas. So they're continuing to try to bully him into giving them what they want. But he doesn't give in. He responds not with anger or hostility, but with poise, saying, he basically calls out this officer for hitting him unnecessarily. Interestingly, in Jewish law, to strike somebody was akin to like assault. Like if for us in the modern day, legal sense, that it would be akin to assault. And it was a pretty serious offense. So St. John is drawing our attention here to the irony that, Jesus is being accused of disrespecting the high priest, and yet he's being struck by the guard, which is a much worse offense, than speaking out, out of turn or something like that. So again, he's not being treated very fairly in this first interrogation. So in the end, Annas ships Jesus off to Caiaphas, since he's not getting anything useful out of him, and maybe the Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin could do better. So now we are in verse 25. Now Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. Remember, he's outside. Him and John are not inside, hearing the interrogation. He's outside warming himself with servants and the guard outside. And it was cold, and they were warming themselves by a fire. Therefore they said to him, "You are not also one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of him whose ear Peter cut off, said, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter then denied again, and immediately a rooster crowed. So again, Jesus is, in the meantime, right? Jesus is withstanding the political powers of the day. He's literally standing toe to toe with the dynastic leader of the Jewish religious party, and the religious high court. And at the same time, Peter is cowering here before servant girls and slaves and the guards of the high priests. So now he's denying Christ to save his own skin, because if they know him, he could be arrested. If they saw him in the garden attack Malchus, the high priest's servant, they could come after him. So now he's just denying Christ to protect himself. So the final detail that St. John gives about his denials is that it happens immediately when the rooster crows. And this would have been at 3 o'clock in the morning. Typically when the roosters start to crow is around 3 o'clock in the morning. So St. John doesn't include any more details about what happens to St. Peter until after the resurrection. So he kind of leaves it at that. Other of the evangelists talk about how Peter went out and wept bitterly, how Christ, looked at him at that time from his trial. He looked down and met eyes with Peter at that point, and Peter went out and wept bitterly. St. John doesn't include any of that stuff. He doesn't want to dig further into St. Peter's fall, right? Because St. Peter and John are friends. As we'll see after the resurrection, the two of them are the ones that go to the tomb when St. Mary Magdalene comes and tells them that the tomb is empty. They go together. So St. John leaves it at that, knowing that we know the rest. So that's Peter's denials 3 times, just like Jesus told him. So everything that kind of was St. John was setting the table for, when Peter and Christ are talking about how he would never betray him, has now come to pass. Remember, Christ told him that this would happen. So now in verse 28, they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium, and it was early morning. But they themselves did not go into the praetorium, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Pilate then went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered and said to him, "If he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you." Then Pilate said to them, "You take him and judge him according to your law." Therefore the Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die." So St. John skips completely over Jesus' trial before Caiaphas in the Sanhedrin. You notice that we went from Annas ships him to Caiaphas, and here in verse 28, he's going from Caiaphas to the praetorium, which is where the Romans are. That's where Pilate is. So he again assumes that we kind of know the details of that. The high priest ripping his robes and proclaiming blasphemy, and they take him from there. The Praetorium was the military headquarters of the Romans in Jerusalem, and it's where the governor, his residence would have been there. So the reason they are not, besides the fact that that's where the Romans are, the reason they're not supposed to go in there is because as the military headquarters, they would have had shrines and altars to the pagan gods there, and would have been offering sacrifices to the pagan gods there. So if they had gone in as Jews, according to their ritual law, they would have been unclean. They would have been, would have needed to go through the steps of purification in order to kind of get back into public life as a Jew. And being the Passover time, if they were unclean by going into the Praetorium, they would not have had enough time to become clean again to eat the Passover, which would have been taking place on Saturday. And again, this now is Thursday night going into Friday morning. So that's why they refused to go into the Praetorium. St. John Chrysostom, in writing on this passage, he finds it intriguing that the Sanhedrin has no problem condemning innocent blood, but they're worried about walking into the Praetorium and defiling themselves in that way. So they even make Pilate come out to them, right? Like they make him come out of his chambers to come and see them outside because they refuse to go in. So it's the same stuff that we've been talking about and that Jesus has been telling us about and telling them about. It's just a different day. They honor the letter of the law, but they neglect the weightier matters and the things that matter most in the eyes of God. So Pilate refuses to pass judgment, since they really don't make an accusation with him, on Jesus. They don't make any real claim. They just kind of say, this guy's bad. He's a bad guy. That's basically what they tell Pilate. They say, if he wasn't evil, we wouldn't have brought him to you. So he must be bad. It's really weak. Their accusation is really weak sauce, as the kids would say. So after their charge against Jesus, Pilate basically tells them to deal with it themselves. He basically tells them, don't waste my time here. Go deal with it. You have a law, you have a court. Go do what you need to do. But again, because the Jews are under Roman occupation, they can't do what they want to do. Because what do they want to do? They want to kill him. But they cannot order executions in any judicial sense because that right belonged to the Romans. So it shows here again that the only thing they want is to kill Jesus. That's it. They just want him gone. But again, it's not lawful for them to do that. Only the Romans can give the capital punishment. So that's why they need Pilate. That's why they're putting Jesus up now to Pilate so that they can get what they want. Again, keep in mind that it's not the law of Moses that's keeping them from doing this, because Moses gives many cases in the law where people would be stoned to death for blasphemy and different things. It's that they cannot legally, under Roman law, take that step that they wanted to. So in the end, Pilate agrees to hear the case. This is further exemplified, the fact that Rome has to do it and not the Jews, that they can't do it themselves, and that Christ is crucified and not stoned. In the Mosaic law, Jesus would have been stoned for being a blasphemer. If he was found guilty, he would have been stoned. He would not have been crucified. So it further shows that his execution was given by the Romans, that he was then sent to be crucified on Golgotha. Contrast that with the death of Saint Stephen in the book of Acts, right? Saint Stephen is stoned to death by a mob. That's different because it's not that the Jews held a judicial hearing and then they although Stephen does give testimony, he's literally attacked by a mob and they kill him. So it's a little bit different here. They're trying to go through the proper channels with Jesus, but with Stephen they'll just attack him. But he's killed by stoning, which is what the Mosaic law tells them to do in that case. So that's now why they find themselves in the Praetorium talking to Pilate, or I should say outside the Praetorium. So now Jesus is in the Praetorium with Pilate. Now we find in verse 33. Then Pilate entered the Praetorium again, called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered him, "Are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done?" So now this begins the official trial. This is Jesus's official trial. In the other Gospels, when Pilate hears the accusation of Jesus claiming to be king of the Jews, he sends Jesus to Herod. If you remember from the other synoptic Gospels, he sends him to Herod, who is actually the king of the Jews. That's his title, the king of the Jews. Again, Pilate was the governor of Jerusalem, but Herod was the king of the Jews at that time. So then after talking with Jesus, Herod sent, and that's the same Herod who killed St. John the Baptist, by the way, who married his brother's wife after he had died. And then St. John had called him out, and then eventually he kills him. So same Herod, just so we have the picture in our minds. And then Herod sends him back to Pilate, which is where we pick up here. St. John doesn't include all this because, as we've been saying, we know it from other accounts. So usually when someone goes to court, it's the accusers who name the charges, right, against the defendant. Usually it's the accusers who have to tell the judge and the jury, what's going on here. That Pilate needs to ask Jesus what he did wrong shows once again that the Jews could name no crime against him, and that Jesus is in charge. Even Pilate, the governor of Jerusalem, has to say, "What did you do?" He's coming to Jesus for information at this point, because the Jews can't give him anything. So Pilate has to come to him to find out what's going on to push the trial forward. The Jews had told Pilate, of course, that Jesus was claiming to be king, the Messiah, in order to overthrow Rome and liberate Israel. That's what their vision of the Messiah was at that time. So the Romans certainly would not have tolerated that. And this is where Pilate starts the trial. He asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He asks him point blank. In that statement there where Pilate says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" The "you" in Greek, is emphatic, meaning that it's almost like you powerless, armyless, weaponless man, you're abandoned by your friends, you're the king of the Jews. Like, oh, kind of like very disdainfully, Pilate is looking at Jesus, this kind of humble figure, and saying like, "Oh, you're the king of the Jews? Like, really? Like, this is who they're bringing to me to then I'm supposed to think he's the king?" Of course, he is the king, but in a different way. Jesus is not the king with armies and chariots and things like that. But Pilate wants to know, basically, are you planning a revolution? Are you planning an insurrection? So that's why Pilate gives his answer there about when Jesus asks him, "Are you speaking on your own behalf, or did they tell you that?" He says, "Your own nation and chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done?" Pilate's almost saying like, you Jews hate us, and yet they're delivering you to us. Like, what did you do for them to hate you so much? So that's how this trial begins. And that brings us to verse 36. Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here." Pilate therefore said to him, "Are you a king then?" Jesus answered, "You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, "I find no fault in him at all." So Jesus tells Pilate plainly. Again, remember we told him, tell Annas, the high priest, I spoke openly in the temples. I spoke, I never kept anything in secret. Here he speaks very openly to Pilate. He speaks very plainly to him, that his kingdom is not what the Jews are saying it is, that they have misunderstood him and his mission. If it was, he wouldn't be standing in Pilate's court. He would be out fighting with his disciples, to liberate Israel. He would be out gathering soldiers and massing an army. The fact that Jesus claims to have a kingdom implies to Pilate that he is indeed a king. So Pilate, in some level, makes a connection there, that Jesus is some kind of king. And Jesus agrees and tells him, basically, yes, that I was born to be a king, but that his kingdom is not from this world, and his kingdom is to bring the truth of God into the world, not to conquer with swords and chariots, but with the truth. So that's why those who hear the truth follow Christ and are part of his kingdom. Now for Pilate, though, being a Roman, being a very much a pragmatist and someone who probably did not think so intellectually all the time, truth is something subjective, something that's a topic of discussion for philosophers. For him, to discuss the truth is a waste of time, because for him, truth is, how many men are in your army and how many men are in the other army. So for Pilate to speak of the truth and to discuss it with Jesus is a further waste of time, which is why he ends the trial immediately. And he gets up and goes out to the Jews and tells them that final ultimatum. What does the truth matter in the cold, violent world of ancient Rome, in other words? So, but in saying this, I think there's a certain level of intended symbolism here, right? Pilate says, what is truth? And yet standing in front of him is Christ, is the truth. The truth is literally standing in front of him as a man, as the God. And Jesus in the scriptures tells us, I am the truth. St. John in his prologue of St. John, chapter 1, the first lesson that we did, talks about that same reality there. So Pilate, even by asking that question and walking out, rejects in his own way Christ as God. He rejects Christ in his own way. The answer to Pilate's question is literally standing right in front of him, but he can't see it. He's not able to. He doesn't have the spiritual eyes to see that. So verse 39, the last two verses here. But you have a custom that I should release someone to you at the Passover. Do you therefore want me to release to you the king of the Jews? Then they all cried again, saying, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. So Pilate finds no fault in Jesus and tries to use this claim of the custom of releasing a prisoner at Passover to free Jesus without, starting something bigger among the people. Because if he crucifies Jesus and a riot breaks out, then he'll probably, be removed from his post and receive capital punishment himself. So he doesn't want that. Certainly doesn't want that. He also doesn't want to punish Jesus because, as we know from the other scripture accounts, his wife had a dream about Jesus and had told Pilate not to have anything to do with this righteous man. It's interesting. I'll connect that here a little deeper. So Father Stephen DeYoung, again, his podcasts are awesome. He says that historically, there's no evidence of such a custom of releasing the prisoner on the Passover. So he explains here this is his theory, right? So Father Stephen thinks that Pilate is deeply conflicted. On the one hand, his wife has told him not to do anything bad, and the Romans and the ancient Greeks and the ancients were very superstitious. So if your wife has a dream telling you not to do anything to this righteous man, that dream is probably from the gods, and if you do the opposite of it, you're going to upset the gods, which will lead to bad things. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, if he doesn't do something to Jesus, then the Jewish leaders will be upset, and who knows what could happen, because it's Passover and there's a million people in Jerusalem, and then there could be a riot, and then bad things could happen again. So he's conflicted, and he's looking for a way out of the situation. So his theory is that Pilate makes it up as he goes on, because that's an easy out for him. If there's a custom of releasing a prisoner at Passover, he can release Jesus and honor his wife's dream and not take action against his own gods. And he can make it look like he's so generous and kind to the Jews of releasing a prisoner at Passover time, and therefore placate the Jews at the same time. So his theory is that that's what's going on. That Pilate basically makes up this rule as he's going on to kind of give him an out. Now, he doesn't obviously anticipate that the Jews will pick someone else. He obviously is not ready for that, right? So it doesn't work out for him in the end because they ask for Barabbas. And Barabbas is exactly the kind of person that the Jews are making Jesus out to be, but who he's not, and exactly the kind of person that the Romans don't want roaming the street. He's exactly the worst case scenario for Pilate. So Barabbas was a robber. He was a violent thief and a rebel, which we hear again in some of the other scripture passages as well. Barabbas as a name literally means son of the father. Bar meaning son, Abba meaning father, son of the father. On the other hand, you have Jesus, who is the true Messiah, the King, the Prince of Peace, the way, the truth, and the life, who is the authentic son of the Father. So you have two sons of the fathers here. You have an imposter and you have the authentic one. And who did the Jews choose? They choose the false. They choose the false one. They've exchanged evil for good. And so that's where Jesus' trial ends, and really that's where he's sentenced at that point to death. So that ends here, chapter 18. That ends chapter 18 of the Gospel of John. So at this time, if there's any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and fire away. Otherwise, we'll break for the evening and we'll meet again next Tuesday.
I have a quick question, Father.
Yes.
Mark. Why does St. John feel it necessary to name the servant? Malchus, I think is his name.
Yeah. So again, if Father Stephen DeYoung in his podcast brings us this point up, that at certain points, not just St. John, but the other evangelists too, they will name individual people, because again, those people, for the audiences reading the scriptures at that time, those people would have been alive and would have been people that the new Christians could have actually gone and talked to verify the accounts. So if John, knowing the high priest, because again, that's how he gets into the court, tells us that it's Malchus who was attacked, and that he has a relative, right? He even mentions that there's a relative of Malchus in the court with Peter. They can go and find those men and talk to them about what happened. The other point he gives, I think it's in Luke's gospel. He talks about Simon of Cyrene, who's the one who helps Jesus carry the cross. I believe it's in Luke's gospel. He identifies Simon as the father of Alexander and Rufus. Now, why is that detail important? Why? Because Alexander and Rufus were still alive at that point. People could have gone and said, hey, what did your father tell you about the day that he helped Jesus carry the cross? So those little historical points there, those historical data points are given, so almost inviting people to go and find these people out to confirm the accounts that they are giving. So that's why he gives the example of, he gives the name of Malchus there. There's really, besides that, there's really no other significance. I mean, it doesn't really come back to play, it doesn't play again later in the story at all. Malchus doesn't later become like a Christian or a saint like that. So it's interesting that you asked, because I literally just thought that I was listening to that today, him explaining that, so it worked out perfectly. God provides. Any other questions?
Hey, Father, I have a question.
Yes.
What's the name of that podcast that you're speaking of?
The Whole Counsel of God.
Thank you.
It's on ancient faith. The Whole Counsel of God. Father Stephen DeYoung.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Anyone else? Any other questions? All right, very good. We'll depart for the evening, and God willing, we'll be able to gather again next week. So we only have 3 chapters left, and then we're all done with the gospel. So let's keep moving forward and get through these last 3 chapters. All right, thank you all. I appreciate your time. God bless you and be with you. And again, God willing, we can all meet again next Tuesday night. Thank you.
Thank you, Father.
Have a good night.
Father.